This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace.
Some of my favorite videos I make these days are the little documentaries I produce on other photographers, where they get to talk a little bit about their work and their process. And it's great because I get to get out from in front of the camera and get behind it and become a little bit of a filmmaker, where I have to select the right shots, find the right B-roll, work out the pacing and the edit, choose the right music. But at the core of all that is capturing the photographer themselves talking about their work. So to make sure that I was filming documentaries of a high standard, I knew I needed to go out there and teach myself how to light and film a good-looking interview. And so I went and did a lot of research. I watched a lot of other documentary films and series to work out how professional filmmakers are lighting and capturing their interviews, so that I could build my own philosophy around it, my own system for lighting and filming and capturing audio, so that I knew that when I arrived with those photographers on the day, I wouldn't be wasting anybody's time and that I would be prepared. So over the last few years, I've developed some skills and come up with a system that works for me, and a setup that I know that no matter which interview I'm filming, it will give me a consistent quality across all the documentaries that I film. And I realized the other day that at this point I probably have a lot to pass on. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the cameras that I use, the focal lengths that I choose, the audio setup that I have to capture clean audio, how I light an interview to make it look compelling, and how all that works together to make sure that it's a story well told. So let's start with the setup that I use and a bit of the theory behind it.
When it comes to building the look of your interviews, I think it's important to first decide what sort of look you're going for. And for me, I like a naturalistic look. And the naturalistic look is built on motivated lighting. Motivated lighting seeks to imitate existing light sources in the scene rather than create new ones. A light source should be justifiable if the viewer chooses to question where it's coming from. This preserves the geography of the space and helps the audience believe the world of the story. Let me start by showing you examples of cinematographers who don't take this naturalistic approach, just so you can see the difference between the two. This is the work of Janusz Kaminski, who is a cinematographer who's a long-time collaborator with Steven Spielberg. And you can see in these shots that the lighting is beautiful, but it's not motivated. There are hair lights coming from ceilings which don't really make visual sense. There's side lighting coming in and separating lighting that is beautiful to look at in the scene, but if you actually ask the question, where is that hair light actually coming from, you wouldn't have a ready answer. It's beautiful to look at, and it's an absolutely valid approach to beautiful cinematography, but it's not naturalistic, motivated lighting. Like these stills from the film Pulp Fiction, the cinematographer here is Andrzej Sekula, and you can see that he doesn't care about trying to make the lighting make sense, he just wants things to look beautiful. I mean, take a look at this shot of Samuel L. Jackson. You have to ask yourself, where on earth is this hair light coming from? There seems to be a light coming from the ceiling that's almost as bright as the light outside, maybe even brighter. That doesn't make visual sense in the scene, but it's a great looking shot. This is another great example from Tarantino of the same sort of thing, this unfeasibly bright overhead light indoors. And this is the work of Robert Richardson. He's the cinematographer on Inglourious Basterds. And I have to say, by the way, that this scene is one of my favorite scenes in all of cinema. So there's no right or wrong about this. This is just a stylistic preference. But if you look at the shots from the scene, where is this overhead light coming from? You can see from the shadows that it's coming from directly overhead, it's not coming from the window outside. And when you look at the reverse shots, you can see that the light on the table is brighter than the sunshine shining outdoors, which doesn't make any visual sense to us, but it doesn't matter because this is a stylized approach. They're not going for naturalistic, motivated lighting. Okay, so now let's look at motivated lighting. These are stills from the film Seven, which was directed by David Fincher. The cinematographer here is Darius Khondji. You can see in each scene where the light is coming from. You can see outdoors a very naturalistic lighting with rain falling. He's not trying to fill shadows or hit Brad with hair lights or anything like that. And this shot indoor of the two talking in the lounge, you can see that the lighting is supposed to be coming from the lamp on the left. There's no way it actually is because it's not bright enough to do this, but the direction of the light and the color of the light, they're trying to sell you that the light on that left-hand side of the frame is what's lighting the two of them. They're attempting motivated, naturalistic lighting. And you're probably sick of hearing me talk about him on this channel, but Roger Deakins, for me, is a master of naturalistic, motivated lighting. He does light his scenes, but he often lights them in such a way as to make the lighting look invisible. This shot of Leonardo sitting in a restaurant, you can see that the sunlight is coming from the right direction. There's a bit of a bounce off the table. There's probably is lighting in the scene, but it looks naturalistic. You could buy that that is one light source coming in through a window. This shot from No Country for Old Men is a great example. I can see the lighting in this shot. There's definitely more light on him than there might be in that scene naturally, but Roger's made sure that the light comes from the window side, so you buy that it is actually window light, and he's maybe boosted it slightly, but he's resisted the temptation to throw in hair lights or rim lights from behind to light that subject because he still wants the scene to feel natural. So when I started doing research and looking at how interviewers lit their scenes, I realized that there was the same kind of separation. Some wanted to light things naturalistically, and some wanted to stick in a lot of lights and make things sort of hyper-real with lots of hair lights and rim lights and backlights. I gravitated more towards those one light, motivated lighting, naturalistic setups. And I noticed a few things about these naturalistic interview setups. One is that the look is usually built on one motivated light source, which is just designed to lift the subject slightly away from the background by making them slightly brighter in the frame. Two is that the subject is pulled away from the background to create some separation in that depth of field and that fall off. And three is that the camera is almost always shooting into the shadow side of the face and not the lit side. And I'll show you how this works in the setup. This is important because it creates interesting shape and mood and character to a face. And in fact, if we take a look at interviews where we're shooting into the light side of the face, for me personally, my preference, I feel like the face starts to look very flat and washed out and less interesting. So if you want to create that mood, always make sure that you're shooting into the shadow side. So when you now look at stills from my interviews, the ones that I've shot, hopefully you can see that philosophy at play, that I'm using that one motivated light source that's coming from a direction that makes sense, either a window or a skylight in the scene, that I'm pulling my subject away from the background to create a little bit of separation. And in my case, I'm using 2 angles for every interview so that I can cut between them. So let me draw you a little diagram of how I actually set this up. So I think about my interview setups like an inverted kite shape, with my subject sitting at the top and me sitting down at the bottom, and the eye line for our interview being down the center of that inverted kite. Then on the one side of me, there will be my 2 cameras, and they'll be quite close together on a slightly different axis, but pretty close together on their tripods. One will be a 35mm and one will usually be a 55mm focal length to give slightly different focal length, axis, and depth of field, so you can feel when that cut actually happens and that it's a legitimate cut for the shot. That will depend on the room, because on the opposite side of me will sit my light, and the light has to sit so that it's firing light into one side of the face, giving kind of a pleasing sort of Rembrandt look to the shot, and that light will sit on the same side as my subject as the natural light that's coming in through the room. So that will usually be the side of my subject where there's some kind of window or light source that's already present. And that means that as I'm shooting light into one side of the face, my subject is looking down the center at me and my cameras are on the opposite side. It means that both those angles will be shooting into the shadow side of the face to give more visual interest to the shot as my subject is talking to me.
So let me show you what this setup looks like in an actual space. And I'm just here in my kitchen at the moment. And you're going to quickly learn that that inverted diamond is going to have to flex depending on the room and the direction of the lighting and the space you actually have to play with. You can't always get your subject as far away from the background as you want, because if you're filming in people's homes, they don't have that much space. So the first thing that I would do in a room like this, you'll notice at the moment that I've got on these kind of yellowy, tungsten-y overhead lights, is I'm going to switch all of those off. Because the one thing I don't want is kind of light colors mixing on my subject's skin tone. So I don't want tungsten overhead light mixing with cooler daylight coming in from outside. I'm going to use the natural daylight of the scene to light the background, and I've got a daylight balanced light, which I'll show you in a second, that's going to light the subject. So those lights will balance, they'll mix with each other well, they're almost the same color tone, and there's no other overhead lights of different colors mixing on the skin tones. One thing I'm going to do is turn on, though, this little lamp in the background, because I've already worked out it looks quite nice for the background. It's not overhead, it's not mixing with the skin tone of the subject, it's just adding some background interest to those plants and that wall. And when you use a light that's in the scene like this, like a lamp, filmmakers would call that a practical light. So the light that I'm actually using to light the subject is the aperture 120D, which is a daylight balanced monoblock. I'm going to turn it on here. You can see I've got a softbox on it with a grid on the front so that I can keep the direction of that light focused on the subject, not too much spill on the background. And I've set the power so that it's roughly matching the light that's coming in from the background, but just lifting the subject, which will be me in a second, off the background a little bit. Let me show you the cameras. So I have two Sonys here. Switch these on. One is an A7 III, the other is an A7C, both full frames, both exactly the same sensor, set to exactly the same picture profile, so they're going to grade together quite nicely. One is a 55mm angle, and the other is a 35mm angle, both set to 1.8 to give a little bit of separation from the background, and you can see there that they're on pretty much the same axis. You could absolutely, and people will ask, can I just use one camera on 4K and punch in and out? Yes, of course you can absolutely do that if you only have one camera. The reason I choose to do two cameras, two focal lengths, both slightly off axis from each other, is when that cut comes in, you can feel it's a legit cut between two camera angles, and it just sells it a bit more. But yes, you could absolutely just do a punch in. The only other thing to mention, I think, is if you're using this daylight that's coming in, you have to be aware if the clouds are coming and going on any particular day, that light will go up and it will go down. And especially if you have the actual window in the shot, that light might change drastically. So what I do is I set my cameras to manual and I expose for the light from this light hitting the skin tone. That's going to mean that the background is going to shift. There's nothing you can do about that. We don't have the budgets to control the lighting outside as well and black out windows and light from outside. We're just using one light. So I would want to make sure that the light on my subject's skin is exposed correctly, and if the background shifts a lot, there's not a lot I can do about it. The only thing I keep in mind is if the light is changing a lot, then I probably want to make sure that I don't have the window in shot, or maybe I'll try and set something up that's more artificially lit in the background and less daylight coming in, so there's not such a drastic shift. When it comes to audio, I use these little Zoom H1s, and inside I just plug in a little Rode Smart Lav. That sits hooked onto my subject so that they can talk. It captures the audio separately. It's nice and clean. It's not compressed by the internals of the camera. And the little audio recorder just sits behind my subject there. The lav comes up through a shirt usually and clips on the top. Nice clean audio that I can sync later. Okay, so I'm going to set you up there. And you can see in this shot that we have our light on the left-hand side of our inverted kite. We've got our two camera angles here, and this is my eye line for my subject. Now I'm going to jump in there with these cameras rolling, and I'm going to look. This is how it would look if you were me giving this interview. So I would usually be sat over there with a notebook with some questions and some ways that I wanted to take the interview, and I would tell the person, this is your eye line, stick with me. So I'm going to cut into an interview now, and I'm going to imagine that you've just asked me the question, how do I deal with subjects on the day and put them at ease, and what sort of things do I tell them when I'm actually performing the interview, to give you an idea of what it looks like, but hopefully also to give you some useful information. You ready? So the first thing I would do before the interview starts is I would let my subject know, hey, this is digital, we're not shooting film here, so you can talk for as long as you want. If you don't like something you've said, we can always cut it out. I want you to feel free just to talk to me. Don't over-prepare, don't try and get clever with the wording too much. I genuinely want just your response to the things that I'm asking you. So feel free just to talk, and we can cut things out as we go. Today we're going to film for about an hour or two, which is going to generate a lot of footage, but I can't use most of that. I only need about 15 minutes for the piece that I'm making. So don't feel like everything has to be great. I'm going to be listening for those key moves in your story that I can put together in a way that makes sense. Something I warn my subjects about up front is that I won't appear on camera or even have the audio of me asking the question, which means that there's no context. And on the day, I won't actually ask questions. I'll say something like, tell me about how you began in photography, which is more an invitation to tell a story than an actual question. And I'll warn them that they need to preface their answers because the context of the question won't appear anywhere. So when they answer something like, hey, tell me about how you began in photography, they need to say something like, Well, I began in photography when I was 6 years old and my mom bought me a camera. They include what I've asked them in the actual answer as well to give that context. You'll notice in the documentaries that I do as well that I do an intro and an outro before the actual documentary starts. And that's not just because I'm a narcissist and I want to include myself in everything. There's a reason for it. It's because I tell my subjects, listen, don't promote yourself. Don't promote your work or your workshops or your books or your magazines or anything else that you're doing. Let me do that for you in the intro and the outro, because I want them to be free just to tell their story and not to feel like they have to promote themselves. If they slip into promotion mode, I feel like we lose the impact of the story. So I ask them to let me do the showing off for them. But at the end of the day, it's my job to make them feel at ease and comfortable. So I will keep it about this conversation between the two of us. And I will say, listen, just speak, you and me. It's a conversation, okay? Ignore the cameras, ignore the lights. I know it feels a bit uncomfortable, but I want you and me to connect right here because I think that will come across on camera. And it usually takes about 10, 15 minutes, but they do slowly start to forget about the cameras in the room. And I try and make sure that I'm giving facial expressions that show that I'm listening and that I'm engaged with what they're saying without making a sound. Sometimes you'll hear me break that and I'll actually laugh in the background or something to something they've said, which is my mistake. But I'm trying to let them know that it's me and them connecting and the cameras are just capturing what's actually happening. And then I want to ask them about their inspiration, about their journey, about the struggles that they've overcome. Because I know that if they tell their story as honestly as they can, my hope is that that story then goes out and connects with other people who are going to view that interview and it's going to connect with them in their story and give them inspiration. And in my mind, I always have that I'm using these cameras as a megaphone to get their interview out there, to get their story out there in the hopes that it inspires other people as well. This was a pretty practical video for me, so I hope you picked up some useful tips and tools so you can go out there and tell your own stories. But remember that these are only the technical considerations. There's also the human element, and it's going to be your job as the interviewer to set your subject at ease, to draw them out, and to ask them really good questions that unlocks their authentic story and captures it on video so that hopefully it finds the right audience and they in turn are inspired. I wish you the best of luck. And lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself for over a decade now as my website of choice. I remember when I started out as a photographer, I always had in mind that it would be great one day to be selling my own work through my website, either as books or magazines or prints, but being quite intimidated by how that would actually work. But when I set up my store using Squarespace, I found the process really easy. I loaded up my products, I put up pictures of those products and set prices and put in descriptions and set everything live. And once I'd integrated that with my Stripe account, it took payments easily. I could see the orders that were coming in, where they needed to be shipped to, and I could even send my customers automated emails to let them know that their parcel was on the way. It couldn't have been simpler.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.